Richard Williams had everything: wealth, power, and a beautiful wife who swore to love him until death did them part. But when his health mysteriously began to fail, he realized that death was coming far sooner than he expected, and it wasn't by chance. As the poison slowly drained the life from his body, a hidden betrayal unraveled. His wife, the woman he trusted most, was orchestrating his demise, carefully crafting the perfect murder. But she had underestimated two things: the sharp instincts that had built his empire, and the quiet maid who had been watching everything. Now, with death at his doorstep, Richard must outplay the woman plotting his downfall. The game is no longer about survival, it's about revenge. And this time, the predator is about to become the prey. Hello, family, welcome to True Life Stories. Please subscribe and leave a like for us, it means the world to us. Also, share this video to your friends and loved ones, and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The grand chandelier in the Williams estate cast a golden glow over the lavish dining hall. The long mahogany table gleamed under the light, set with the finest silverware and porcelain plates. Seated at the head of the table was Richard Williams, a man in his mid-40s, exuding the kind of confidence only immense wealth could afford. His sharp eyes, once filled with vigor, had dulled over the past few months, though he barely understood why. Across from him, Vivian Williams, his beautiful wife of 5 years, delicately cut into her filet mignon, her every movement graceful, practiced. She was in her early 30s, with striking eyes that held the promise of devotion. To the outside world, she was the epitome of a doting wife. But behind that perfectly polished mask lurked a dangerous secret. "Darling, you barely touched your food," Vivian murmured, her voice dripping with concern as she reached across the table to touch his hand. "You've been looking so pale lately. I'm starting to worry." Richard sighed, pushing his plate aside. "I don't know, Viv. I just haven't felt like myself lately. Maybe I need to see another doctor." She tilted her head, feigning thoughtfulness, though in reality, she knew exactly why he felt the way he did. The substance she had been adding to his meals worked slowly, subtly. Nothing too drastic, just enough to make him weaker day by day. She had planned it meticulously, researching poisons that wouldn't be immediately detected, consulting obscure medical journals, and ensuring every dose was just right. A quick death would be too suspicious. No, she needed this to look like natural deterioration. Vivian smiled sympathetically. "Perhaps you're just overworking yourself again, my love. Let me handle things for a while. You should rest." Richard nodded, rubbing his temples. His businesses demanded a lot from him, but lately, even the simplest tasks had become exhausting. He trusted Vivian. She had always been by his side. Yet, deep down, something felt off. A maid entered the dining hall, clearing the plates with practiced efficiency. She was young, no older than 25, with her hair tied neatly into a bun. Jasmine had worked in the Williams estate for nearly 2 years and had seen the couple's dynamic up close. She had heard Vivian's sugary sweet words, had watched the way she played the role of the perfect wife. But Jasmine had also seen something else, something unsettling. As she picked up Richard's half-eaten plate, her eyes flickered to Vivian, who was watching her closely. There was something calculated about the way she held her wine glass, something almost victorious. A chill ran down Jasmine's spine, though she said nothing. Vivian raised her glass in a silent toast to herself as Richard leaned back in his chair, exhausted. The game had begun, and she was certain she would win. The morning sun streamed through the vast windows of the Williams estate, casting warm golden hues across the room. The house was silent, save for the occasional rustle of the servants going about their duties. Richard Williams sat in his private study, rubbing his temples as a dull ache pulsed in his head. He had barely slept. The fatigue had been creeping in for weeks, slowly at first, a yawn here, a moment of dizziness there, but now it was undeniable. His body felt sluggish, weighed down by an invisible force. His limbs ached, his vision blurred at odd intervals, and no matter how much he rested, exhaustion clung to him like a persistent shadow. There was a time, not long ago, when Richard had been a force of nature. He built his empire with sharp instincts and unrelenting drive, commanding boardrooms with confidence. But now, even signing documents felt like a task too heavy to bear. "Sir," a voice called softly from the doorway. It was Andrew, his personal assistant. The doctor has arrived. Richard straightened, pushing aside his discomfort. Send him in. A few moments later, Dr. Whitmore, a distinguished man in his 60s, entered with a reassuring smile. Richard, good to see you. Vivian mentioned you haven't been feeling well. Vivian. She had arranged this visit, of course. Always the doting wife. Richard managed a weak smile. I just feel drained. Like my body is betraying me. My energy is gone, and I can't shake this constant fatigue. Dr. Whitmore hummed thoughtfully, checking Richard's pulse, examining his eyes, and asking a series of routine questions. Finally, he sighed. Your symptoms suggest stress-induced fatigue, possibly an iron deficiency. We'll run some tests, but for now, you need rest, proper meals, and maybe less work. Richard exhaled sharply. He wasn't convinced, but what else could he do? He wasn't a doctor. As the doctor left, Vivian entered the study, a soft look of concern on her face. She held a tray with a steaming bowl of soup and a glass of fresh orange juice. You should eat something, she said, setting the tray on his desk. Dr. Whitmore says you need to rebuild your strength. Richard eyed the soup but felt no appetite. Still, he forced a spoonful into his mouth. The warm broth slid down his throat, and almost immediately, a familiar wave of sluggishness settled over him. He barely noticed as Vivian sat on the edge of his desk, watching him with quiet satisfaction. You'll be back to your old self in no time, she cooed. I'll take care of you. Richard wanted to believe her. But deep inside, a gnawing sense of unease whispered that something wasn't right. Meanwhile, outside the study door, Jasmine stood frozen. She had been passing by when she overheard the conversation. Peering through the slight gap in the doorframe, she watched as Vivian gently stroked Richard's hair, her expression unreadable. Jasmine's stomach twisted. There was something about the way Vivian watched him, something cold and calculating. She gripped the handle of the serving cart tightly. Something was very, very wrong. And she was going to find out what. The mansion was quiet that evening, save for the soft hum of the kitchen's industrial refrigerator and the occasional clang of silverware against fine china. Jasmine moved carefully through the grand halls, her worn flats barely making a sound against the polished marble floors. She had worked in many wealthy households before, but the Williams estate was something else. Its sheer size, the grandeur of its decor, and most of all, the eerie silence that seemed to creep through its walls. Tonight, though, the air felt heavier. She could feel it in her bones. Jasmine had always been an observant woman, a trait that served her well in a house like this. She had learned early on that the walls whispered secrets if one only paid attention. And lately, those whispers revolved around one thing: Richard Williams's declining health. At first, she had dismissed it as a natural occurrence. He was a hard-working man, after all. But the way Vivian fluttered around him, always bringing him his meals personally, always watching him as he ate, it unsettled Jasmine. The man was wealthy beyond measure, yet his condition deteriorated despite having the best medical care at his disposal. Something wasn't adding up. That night, as she finished tidying the dining room, Jasmine saw Vivian enter the kitchen. The lady of the house rarely ventured there herself. The cooks prepared the meals, the maids served them. There was no reason for her to be handling food personally. And yet, here she was. Curiosity got the better of her. Keeping her steps light, Jasmine inched closer, peeking through the gap between the pantry shelves. What she saw sent a chill down her spine. Vivian stood at the counter, carefully opening a small glass vial. Its contents were a fine, almost translucent powder. With meticulous precision, she tipped the vial over Richard's bowl of soup, stirring it in until it vanished completely. Jasmine's breath hitched. The realization hit her like a blow to the chest. Vivian was poisoning him. Jasmine forced herself to stay calm, though every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, to do something. But she knew she had to be smart. If Vivian realized she had been caught, Jasmine's own life could be in danger. Silently, she backed away, slipping out of the kitchen before she was noticed. Her mind raced. She needed proof. No one would believe a mere maid's word against the elegant and well-respected Vivian Williams. Her hands trembled as she wiped them on her apron. She needed to warn Richard. But how? He was deeply under Vivian's influence, and in his weakened state, he might not even believe her. No, she needed a plan. A way to expose the truth before it was too late. Taking one last glance over her shoulder, she disappeared into the dimly lit hallway, determination burning in her chest. She wouldn't let this happen. She couldn't, because if she didn't act soon, Richard Williams would be dead. The grandfather clock in Richard Williams's study ticked steadily, its rhythmic sound filling the vast space. Outside, the evening wind rustled through the trees, and the mansion sat in eerie silence. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, his body heavy with exhaustion. His once commanding presence was diminished. The man who built an empire now struggled to keep his eyes open past dinner. The flickering fire in the hearth cast shadows across the walls when a soft knock broke the stillness. "Come in," Richard called, his voice hoarse. The door creaked open, revealing Jasmine. She stepped in hesitantly, her hands gripping the folds of her apron. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but she had made up her mind. She had watched for too long. Tonight, she would tell him. "Mr. Williams," she began, her voice quiet but firm. "I need to speak with you. It's important." Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. "Jasmine, if this is about the kitchen arrangements, speak with the head staff. I don't have the energy for." "It's about Mrs. Williams," Jasmine interrupted. At that, Richard's tired eyes lifted to meet hers. There was something in her expression, urgency, fear, something real, that made him straighten. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." Jasmine did, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking. "Sir," she said, her voice steady now, "I've been noticing things for a while. And tonight, I saw something I can't ignore." Richard studied her face, his instincts sharpening despite the fog in his mind. "Go on." Jasmine inhaled sharply, gathering her courage. "Mrs. Williams is poisoning you." Silence. For a moment, Richard thought he had misheard. Then slowly he sat forward. "What did you just say?" "I saw her," Jasmine whispered. "In the kitchen. She had a vial. She poured something into your soup. I've suspected it for a while, but tonight I saw it with my own eyes." Richard exhaled, his fingers gripping the armrests of his chair. His mind reeled. Poison? His own wife? The woman he had trusted, loved? His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to think. "You're sure?" His voice was dangerously low now, his sharp mind momentarily cutting through the exhaustion. Jasmine nodded fervently. "I wouldn't have come to you if I wasn't. She's been doing it slowly, hasn't she? That's why the doctors can't find anything. It's in your food, sir. That's why you're sick." A wave of nausea that had nothing to do with poison rolled through him. Richard clenched his fists, rage bubbling beneath his skin. How long had this been going on? How much had he ignored? His health had begun failing months ago, and through it all, Vivian had been there, smiling sweetly, bringing him meals, brushing his hair back with delicate fingers as she whispered, "I'll take care of you." His stomach twisted. Jasmine hesitated before speaking again. "I think she's waiting, making sure it's slow, so no one suspects. When you die, sir, she'll inherit everything." Richard's jaw tightened. His mind raced through every interaction, every touch, every lie. If what Jasmine said was true, and deep down he felt that it was, he couldn't afford to react blindly. He needed proof. He needed a plan. His eyes met Jasmine's, and in them she saw something shift, an awakening, a fire that had long been dimmed. "Jasmine," he said, his voice cold and sharp, "from this moment on, you say nothing to anyone. Not a word. We play this carefully." She nodded quickly. "What do we do?" Richard exhaled, his mind calculating. "Tomorrow, I continue eating as usual. I pretend nothing has changed. But I won't actually eat the food." Jasmine's brow furrowed. "How?" "I'll find ways to dispose of it when she's not looking," Richard said. "You'll help me if needed. Meanwhile, we gather proof. We need evidence, real, undeniable evidence." His voice grew darker. "And when the time is right, we expose her." Jasmine swallowed hard, but she nodded. "I'll help you." Richard leaned back in his chair, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. He had been blind for too long. But now he was awake, and his wife had no idea. The next morning, Richard Williams sat at the grand dining table as usual, his hands resting lightly on the arms of his chair. The long mahogany table stretched before him, set with gleaming silverware and an elegant breakfast spread. A soft melody played from the speakers in the corner, filling the vast space with gentle piano notes. Vivian entered the dining room with her usual grace, carrying a tray with a steaming bowl of porridge. She smiled warmly, setting it down in front of him. "I made this myself," she said, brushing a hand over his shoulder. "Something light, to help you feel better." Richard looked at her, his face betraying no emotion. If he hadn't known better, he might have mistaken her for a devoted wife. But he did know better now. "Thank you, darling," he murmured, picking up his spoon. He stirred the porridge, watching the thick, creamy surface shift. Somewhere in that mixture was the poison, the very substance meant to wear him down until his body gave out. Vivian sat across from him, her chin resting in her palm as she watched him with quiet interest. "Did you sleep well?" she asked sweetly. Richard took a slow breath. "As well as can be expected." He lifted the spoon to his lips, but only pretended to take a bite. Years of business negotiations had taught him control, the art of deception. He let the spoon hover near his mouth before subtly tilting it downward, allowing the porridge to slip back into the bowl. With calculated movements, he stirred the mixture again and repeated the motion, never once actually swallowing. Vivian's eyes flickered over him, watching, waiting. "Do you like it?" she asked. Richard forced a small smile. "Delicious." Vivian's gaze lingered for a moment longer before she nodded approvingly. "I knew it would be." He continued the act, feigning small bites, shifting the porridge around. And when she momentarily glanced toward her phone, he took the opportunity to discreetly drop a portion into the linen napkin resting on his lap. Every movement was controlled, precise. He had spent the previous night practicing in the mirror, ensuring his deception was flawless. By the time he set the spoon down, the bowl was nearly empty. Vivian beamed. "I'm so glad you're eating properly again." Richard wiped his mouth with the napkin, careful to conceal the poisoned portion, and leaned back in his chair. "You take such good care of me." She reached across the table, squeezing his hand gently. "Always." Inside, Richard felt nothing but cold fury. That night, as the house quieted and the staff retreated to their quarters, Richard stood by his study window, looking out into the darkened gardens. His body was still weak, but his mind had never been sharper. A knock at the door made him turn. Jasmine slipped inside, her eyes filled with tension. "Did you do it?" she whispered. Richard nodded. He moved to his desk and unfolded the linen napkin, revealing the hidden porridge remains. Jasmine's face paled as she stared at it. "Now we test it," Richard said. "We need to know exactly what she's been giving me." Jasmine nodded. "I'll take care of it. But sir, we can't keep this up forever. She'll expect results. If she doesn't see you getting weaker, she'll notice." Richard exhaled sharply. "Then we give her exactly what she wants." Jasmine frowned. "What do you mean?" He turned to her, his eyes dark with determination. "We make her believe she's won." Days passed, then weeks. Richard continued the charade, pretending to grow weaker, his movements slower, his voice softer. Vivian watched him like a hawk, her satisfaction growing with every passing day. Then, on a night carefully chosen, everything fell into place. Richard had arranged it all with Jasmine. A trusted doctor, one of the few people he still had faith in, was brought in to examine him. When the time was right, Richard collapsed in his study, just as planned. Vivian's scream echoed through the mansion. The staff rushed in, gasping as they saw their employer slumped over his desk. His skin was pale, his breathing non-existent. Jasmine clutched her apron, forcing tears into her eyes. Vivian fell to her knees, sobbing dramatically. "No, no, Richard. Someone call an ambulance." The doctor, already in on the plan, performed a fake examination, then slowly shook his head. "I'm so sorry," he said gravely. "He's gone." The room filled with gasps and whispers. Some of the staff wept. Vivian collapsed into the doctor's arms, her body trembling with what appeared to be grief. But inside, Richard knew she was celebrating. His body was discreetly taken away, exactly as he had planned. But not to a morgue, not to a burial site. No, Richard Williams was transported to one of his hidden mansions, a property under a false name, far from prying eyes. He was not dead. He was watching. And soon, Vivian would realize she had made the biggest mistake of her life. Vivian Williams stood in front of the grand mirror in her bedroom, dressed in a black designer gown that hugged her curves in all the right places. The fabric was elegant, expensive, and carefully chosen to reflect the image of a grieving widow. A slight smirk tugged at the corners of her lips as she adjusted her pearl earrings. Everything had gone exactly as she had planned. Richard Williams was dead. His wealth, his empire, everything would soon be in her hands. The attorneys were already working on transferring the assets, and in a matter of weeks, she would be the sole inheritor of one of the largest fortunes in the country. She sighed dramatically, stepping back to admire herself. A mourning widow, beautiful even in her sorrow. Society would pity her. She would receive condolences, sympathy, attention. And best of all, no one would suspect the truth. A soft knock at the door made her turn. "Come in," she called, schooling her expression into one of sorrow. Jasmine stepped inside, head bowed respectfully. She had kept her distance in the days following Richard's death. But now she had a role to play. Her hands were folded neatly in front of her apron, and her face was a carefully crafted mask of sadness. "Mrs. Williams," Jasmine murmured, "the attorneys will be arriving shortly. They've prepared the initial paperwork for the estate transfer." Vivian nodded solemnly. "Thank you, Jasmine. Have them wait in the drawing room." "Of course, ma'am." Jasmine turned to leave, but hesitated. "Forgive me for asking, ma'am, but do you feel all right? You look a little pale." Vivian's eyes flickered with suspicion for a brief second before she forced a soft smile. "I appreciate your concern, Jasmine. It's been a difficult few days." Jasmine nodded, feigning understanding. "Yes, ma'am. I just wanted to make sure. Let me know if you need anything." Vivian watched her go, her brow furrowing slightly. There was something in Jasmine's voice, something off. She shook it off. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered now except securing Richard's fortune. Vivian descended the grand staircase with effortless grace, her black dress trailing behind her like a shadow. The drawing room was filled with the scent of rich mahogany and aged whiskey. Two attorneys stood near the fireplace, portfolios in hand. "Gentlemen," she greeted softly, her voice laced with grief. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." "Mrs. Williams," the elder attorney, Mr. Fletcher, said, bowing his head slightly, "we are deeply sorry for your loss." Vivian nodded, dabbing at the corner of her eye with a silk handkerchief. "It has been devastating." The men exchanged glances before motioning to the documents they had brought. "We've prepared the legal transfer for Mr. Williams's assets, in accordance with his last will and testament," Fletcher explained. "If you could sign here, we can begin processing everything." Vivian stepped forward, her fingers grazing the fine parchment. But just as she reached for the pen, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. She froze. The doors to the drawing room creaked open, and there, standing in the doorway, was Richard Williams. Vivian's breath caught in her throat. Her heart stopped. He was alive. Her mind scrambled to process what she was seeing. He was supposed to be dead. She had watched his lifeless body being taken away. She had cried over it, performed the role of the grieving widow flawlessly. Yet here he was, standing tall, eyes sharp, his presence unmistakable. Silence suffocated the room. The attorneys looked between them, confused, uncertain. Richard took a slow step forward. "My dear wife," he said smoothly, his voice carrying an edge sharper than steel. "You look surprised to see me." Vivian's throat went dry. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. "Perhaps because," Richard continued, his eyes boring into hers, "you were expecting me to be dead." The room tensed. The attorney stiffened. "Jasmine," standing discreetly in the corner, held her breath. Vivian forced herself to speak. Richard, save it. He cut her off coldly. He turned to the attorneys. Gentlemen, I apologize for the confusion. There seems to have been a misunderstanding about my passing. Fletcher cleared his throat. Mr. Williams, we were under the impression that you had. He trailed off, glancing at Vivian, his eyes dark with realization. Yes, Richard said, eyes still locked on his wife. My loving wife ensured the world believed that. Vivian's hands trembled. Her mind spun with explanations, lies, anything to regain control. Darling, I. Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out a small recording device. He pressed play. Vivian's own voice filled the room. He's getting weaker. It won't be long now. Once he's gone, everything will be mine. The color drained from her face. More recordings played. Her hushed conversations, the sound of the vial being opened, even the faint stirring of poison into his meals. Vivian stumbled back. This is fake. Richard chuckled darkly. No, my dear. It's evidence. And not just this. He nodded toward the hallway, and two uniformed police officers stepped inside. The samples of poisoned food? The vial found in your belongings? The medical reports confirming the substance in my bloodstream? That's proof. Vivian's world crumbled in an instant. The attorneys stepped back, their faces unreadable. The police approached, handcuffs at the ready. Vivian's hands clenched into fists. Richard, please, she whispered. We can fix this. You love me. Richard met her gaze with icy contempt. I trusted you, he said, voice like stone. And you tried to kill me. The officers seized her arms, snapping the handcuffs into place. She thrashed. Richard. No, this isn't happening. Richard watched as she was dragged from the room, screaming, begging. And for the first time in months, he felt alive. The courtroom was packed. The air was thick with anticipation, the murmurs of reporters and spectators filling the grand chamber. Cameras flashed as journalists scribbled notes, eager to capture every detail of the case that had shocked the nation. At the front of the courtroom, seated behind the defendant's table, was Vivian Williams. She no longer resembled the poised, elegant woman she once was. Gone was the perfect hair, the designer dresses, the aura of untouchable grace. Instead, she sat rigid, her once glowing complexion dull, dark circles marring the space beneath her eyes. Her hands were clasped tightly together, her knuckles white from pressure. She was still beautiful, but her mask was gone. Across from her, sitting with an air of quiet strength, was Richard Williams. Unlike his wife, he had regained color in his cheeks, his sharp eyes brimming with a determination that had been missing for too long. He was dressed impeccably in a tailored navy suit, his posture commanding, no longer the frail, weakened man his wife had tried to destroy. Vivian's gaze flickered to him, desperation flashing behind her emerald eyes. He did not look away. The judge, a stern woman with piercing eyes, took her seat at the bench. The gavel struck. Court is now in session. The prosecution wasted no time presenting their case. This is not a case of misunderstanding. This is not a case of coincidence. This is a calculated crime of greed, betrayal, and attempted murder. The prosecutor, a seasoned man with a sharp voice, turned toward the jury. Mrs. Williams, the defendant, slowly poisoned her husband over a period of months in an effort to make his death appear natural. The end goal? To inherit his vast fortune. Vivian's lawyer objected, but the judge overruled. The prosecution continued. We have indisputable evidence, including audio recordings of the defendant discussing her plans. A courtroom clerk pressed a button, and Vivian's own voice filled the chamber. He's getting weaker. It won't be long now. Once he's gone, everything will be mine. The sound of her words, her own cold, calculating words, sent a ripple through the room. People gasped. A few reporters exchanged stunned glances, scribbling furiously. Richard remained motionless. He had listened to these recordings before. He had lived them. But hearing them again in front of so many people reminded him of the depth of her betrayal. The prosecutor continued, holding up the toxicology reports. The food samples collected from Mr. Williams's meals contained traces of digitalis, a plant-based toxin known to cause gradual organ failure. The defendant was slowly killing her husband. Vivian's face remained stony, but her fingers twitched. The final blow came when Jasmine was called to the stand. Dressed modestly, her auburn hair pulled back, Jasmine looked smaller than usual. But her voice was clear, steady. "I saw her do it," she said, looking directly at Vivian. "I saw her put something in his food. And when I realized what was happening, I told Mr. Williams. We worked together to expose her." Vivian's expression didn't change, but Richard saw it, the slight flicker of fear in her eyes. Vivian's attorney tried to twist the narrative. "My client was merely caring for her husband. Is it a crime for a wife to prepare meals for her sick spouse?" The jury remained unmoved. The prosecutor countered. If Mrs. Williams was so concerned for her husband's well-being, why did she not allow independent medical testing? Why did she dismiss multiple house staff who voiced concerns? One by one, the truth unraveled. Every piece of evidence stacked against her. Every witness's testimony dug the hole deeper. The jury saw her for what she truly was, a woman who wore love like a disguise while planning her husband's demise. Vivian did not testify. Her lawyer advised against it. It wouldn't have mattered. After days of witness testimonies, forensic evidence, and cross-examinations, the jury deliberated. The room was silent as the judge asked the foreperson to deliver the decision. Vivian sat completely still, her hands folded neatly in front of her. The foreperson stood. "In the matter of attempted murder, we, the jury, find the defendant, Vivian Williams, guilty." A wave of gasps filled the room. Richard let out a slow breath, tension leaving his shoulders. Vivian blinked. Just once. Then her face hardened. The judge's gavel slammed down. "Vivian Williams, you are sentenced to 25 years in federal prison." A murmur swept through the spectators. Journalists scrambled to capture every detail. Vivian turned her head slowly toward Richard. For the first time in the entire trial, she finally spoke directly to him. "I was supposed to have everything," she whispered. Richard met her gaze without emotion. "And now you have nothing." The guards pulled her up, locking the handcuffs around her wrists. As she was led away, she didn't cry, didn't scream. She simply walked out of the courtroom and into a life of irrelevance. The reporters rushed to Richard as he stepped outside the courthouse. "Mr. Williams, do you have a statement?" Richard stopped on the steps, adjusting his cufflinks. He looked out at the flashing cameras, the curious faces, the onlookers whispering his name. For the first time in months, he felt free. He simply said, "Justice has been served." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, toward the rest of his life. The sun was setting over the Williams estate, casting golden light through the tall windows of Richard's study. He sat in his leather chair, a glass of bourbon in hand, gazing out at the vast gardens that stretched beyond the house. The place felt different now, lighter, freer, as though a shadow had been lifted. For months, this house had been suffocating, its walls closing in on him as his strength faded. Now, with Vivian gone, he could breathe again. There was a soft knock at the door. "Come in," Richard said. Jasmine stepped inside, hesitating at the threshold. She wasn't wearing her maid's uniform anymore. Instead, she was dressed in a simple navy blue dress, her auburn hair loosely falling over her shoulders. For the first time, she looked like she belonged in the house, not as a servant, but as someone more. "You don't have to knock anymore, you know," Richard said, offering her a small smile. Jasmine smiled back, stepping inside. "Habit, I guess." Richard gestured to the seat across from him. "Join me." She hesitated before sitting, folding her hands in her lap. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was comfortable, filled with an unspoken understanding. "You're leaving, aren't you?" Richard finally asked. Jasmine bit her lip. "I think it's time," she admitted. "I've been working here for years, and, well, after everything, I don't know if I can go back to just being a maid in this house." Richard studied her. He had known this moment would come, yet hearing it still sent a pang through him. You deserve more, he said quietly. After everything you did for me for saving my life, I owe you more than I can ever repay. Jasmine shook her head. I didn't do it for a reward, Richard. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Richard set his glass down, leaning forward slightly. You always were the smartest one in this house. Jasmine chuckled, a soft blush creeping up her cheeks. I'll take that as a compliment. You should. There was another pause before Richard spoke again, this time more carefully. You know, you don't have to go. Jasmine's eyes met his, something flickering between them. What do you mean? I mean, Richard said, choosing his words, you could stay. Not as an employee, but as something else. Jasmine's breath caught slightly, her heart pounding in a way she hadn't expected. She searched his face, looking for any sign of hesitation. There was none. You don't have to say anything now, Richard added quickly. I've spent so much of my life trusting the wrong people, and you, Jasmine, you're the only person who's ever truly been on my side. Jasmine swallowed, her hands gripping the fabric of her dress. I don't want to be on my own anymore, Richard admitted. Not now. Not after this. Jasmine exhaled, a small smile curving her lips. I don't either. Richard reached across the table, gently taking her hand in his. It was the first time he had touched her like this, without desperation, without urgency. Just something real. She didn't pull away. Instead, she squeezed his hand back. Months passed. The mansion no longer felt like a cage, but a home. The air was filled with warmth, with laughter, something that had been absent for far too long. Richard's health improved dramatically. With the poison gone from his system, his strength returned. He resumed his business, but this time, he was more careful about who he let into his circle. The world had changed for him. He had changed. And Jasmine? Jasmine was no longer just a maid. She was his partner, his confidant, the woman who had saved him in more ways than one. One afternoon, as they walked through the gardens, Richard turned to her. What do you think about leaving all this behind for a while? Jasmine raised an eyebrow. Leaving? A vacation, he said, smiling. No mansion, no legal drama. Just you and me, somewhere far away. Jasmine laughed. You, the great Richard Williams, taking a break. For you? He squeezed her hand. Yes. Jasmine tilted her head, pretending to think. In that case, I accept. Richard grinned. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he pulled her close, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. For the first time in years, Richard Williams wasn't just alive. He was happy. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the story. Do not forget to turn on your notification for my next video. Richard Williams had everything.